Welcome to Ignatius Press Off the Shelf. We continue to discuss St. Augustine's Confessions. This is our first book we're discussing under the new format, and it will be downhill from here. We're not going to be able to find a book of such impact, so classical, part of Western civilization, by a great author, saint. This is really an enormously good book. And as you've been following us, you know that the first 9 books, as they're called, have to do more directly with the narrative of his life, from his birth to his conversion and shortly after that. These next 4 books are more philosophical, and especially book 10 on memory and book 11 on time and eternity. And there are whole philosophies built around what's in these 2 books, and certainly courses of philosophy built around them. So whatever we do is going to be, unfortunately, an abridgment of what should be done. But we'll do this. We can to stay within the limits of our time frame here. Of course, one of the ways of doing that is by not talking so much at the beginning. But we're about halfway through the book on memory here, book 10. And so we go to page 277, kind of left off there. And, Augustine's going into himself now, just like Descartes did. You mentioned Vivian in a previous session here. But he doesn't get lost in himself like Descartes did. But he's questioning. He first is reflecting on what he remembers that he's sensed, that has come through, what he's heard, what he's seen, what he's tasted. But now he's going deeper. Wait a minute, there are things in my memory I couldn't have sensed because they're not sensible. How'd they get there? So he begins in chapter 10 here in book 10. He says, when I hear that there are 3 classes of questions, namely, whether something exists, what it is, and what qualities belong to it. This, by the way, is Aristotle, because they had Aristotle's categories. Didn't have the rest.
Okay.
I do, to be sure, retain images of the sounds by which these words are composed. So he realizes when he hears the idea of existence or esse, or quiddity or essence, or the properties of things has the qualities that you don't sense quality. You might sense red, or pungent, but you don't sense the idea of quality. So where does that come from? Bottom of the page, my ears declare, if they made some sound, we give the information. My nostrils say, blah, if there was a smell. Next page 278, 4 lines down. For when I learned them, these categories, I did not take them on trust from some stranger's intelligence, someone telling me there are categories here, but recognize them as present in my own and intelligence and affirm them as true. So I say, wait a minute, where these come from? Nobody told me about them. I heard the sounds, but I didn't hear the things, and yet I recognize them as true. This means, 2 lines below that they were there even before I learned them, but not remembered. This is very Platonic.
It is.
Well, wait a second. If they're in my memory, but I don't remember them getting there, I must have had some experience prior to my active memory. Page 279, chapter 12. Another type of knowledge. The memory also stores countless truths and laws of mathematics and mensuration, measuring, no single one of which was impressed upon by bodily sense. Like the square root of -1. What is that? He didn't know about that, but I mean, you could talk about, the square root of 64. We know that's 8, but I mean, where did you sense that? They have no color, sound, or smell, nor have they been tasted or handled. The 5 senses. I heard the sound of the words that indicated these truths when they were under discussion, but the sounds are one thing and the truths themselves something else. So he's distinguishing here between
Mm-hmm.
what the sense provides and what my knowledge is aware of. I mean, this is really, I mean,
And we know that Plato, to explain this phenomenon, he believed in reincarnation. They believed in reincarnation. A lot of the Platonists and Neoplatonists did, and because how else can you explain these pre-existing things that we know, and then when we encounter them, we can recognize them as true because in some sense we already knew them or whatever. But then in our discussion with Father Spitzer's book, there's this other explanation that there's some kind of architecture, if you will, of the human soul
right.
that's already prepared in a way to receive this form of knowledge and understanding. And so, but does Augustine ever resolve, Father, what the explanation for this is?
Well, we're going to get to that. And I think that there's, uh, I think, and I'm not an expert on Augustine, so I could be wrong here, but it appears to me that he doesn't fully resolve it. He holds some kind of incompatible views that he doesn't, resolve. I want to say one about reincarnation, though. There's two classes, if you will, of reincarnation. The Platonic idea is that our souls existed in the presence of the good and then became incarnate. That's different from the idea
Oh,
of I was a grasshopper before and I'll be a cow after,
got it.
Uh,
Very important distinction.
yeah.
I'm glad you explained that.
Page 280 at the top. Everyone knows these truths, mathematics now, without a physical representation of any kind being involved. That is not quite right because he himself says we get the sound, right?
Hmm.
And we think of image as a picture, but image can be sound images, taste images, and so on in our imagination. And the fact is that we we know triangle because someone draws three lines on a blackboard and says that's a triangle. And now we associate the word with what we've experienced, but we know something beyond what's experienced because that's not a perfect triangle. But we understand a perfect triangle. I think that's, page 282. Finish this up here, about the middle of the page. We would be in no position to discuss these ideas here unless we found in our memory not just the sound of their names as images derived from sense impressions, but the very notions of the things themselves. So that's his point, is
Hmm.
that the notion is there, has to be there because it didn't come from the senses, but where did it come from?
Right.
And as you're saying, the Aristotelian answer is the architecture is such that we are able to extract or abstract from the sense impression the intelligible essence of a thing. Uh, now, chapter 50 to the bottom there, here's where I say it's ambiguous. It is not easy to say whether this process occurs with the help of images or not. There it is.
Hmm.
He hasn't resolved it.
He hasn't resolved it.
Just a brief thing on page 284, about two-thirds down. He says, I am my mind. And there's a truth to that, but it's also your body as well.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
in terms of the I is self-conscious. I recognize myself as a person. Well, that is not my body. I recognize myself as an embodied I. Excuse me, but it's the I, the self-consciousness, which is myself. And by the way, that's the distinction between animals and AI on the one hand.
Hmm.
Humans, they are not self-conscious in the way we are.
Hmm. And when you say that when he makes these kinds of statements, or even comes down here, he starts out loving music, and then he starts coming down hard on the fact that he takes pleasure from it, and beauty as well, right? So there's still, I think, traces of this struggle against the Manichaeanism of before that separated the world between matter and spirit, and matter was evil and spirit was good. And now he's a Christian, And just as he's struggling with some of these Platonic ideas about what you just explained,
Okay.
and but also I think the body spirit conflict also he's still struggling to resolve. Wouldn't you
Yes,
say?
yes, and remember that his intellectual conversion came precisely when he realized that not everything is matter. But so that idea of spirit as being the turning point in his life, like you say, it might have kind of clouded his vision.
Just a tad. I
Yeah.
hate to criticize. It's like the ant biting the ankle of the elephant here. I don't want to go too far, but I do pick up this kind of inner conflict, shall we say, in him.
Now he proceed again. There's so many topics here which are worthy of discussion and elaboration. But now on page 289, he's talking about happiness,
Mhm.
not just knowledge of mathematical things now, but about a third of the way down. What is the life of happiness? Surely what everyone wants, absolutely everyone without exception. We all want to be happy. But if they all want it so badly, where do they come to know it? Where have they seen it that they're enamored of it? Evidently, we possess it in some fashion. So again, that's his conclusion. Bottom of the page. What I'm attempting to find out is whether this resides in the memory, because if it does, that must mean that we were happy once upon a time. Though whether each of us was happy individually or we were all happy in the man who committed the first sin, in whom we all died, and from whom we all are born to misery. See, there's some mystical here too, because just as he's going to see in his commentary on the Psalms, especially, that we are Christ's mystical body, the body is joined to the head, and therefore, what each member experiences, every member in some sense experiences. What Christ experiences,
Oh,
we experience, and vice versa. So, but he's saying this is a reflection of the first Adam, that in a certain sense, we are all one in Adam, which means man, mankind, humanity, just as we're all one in Christ. So he's getting speculative here, but he's saying, hey, look, if I seek happiness, but I've never experienced it fully, where did I get the idea?
and how do I know that what I'm experiencing is happiness or not?
Exactly.
Or how do I tell the counterfeit from the real, and so on. And of course, the classical antiquity struggled with this question too, because it seems to be, a pretty commonly observed phenomenon that A, everyone wants to be happy, and B, this we know somehow that what we experience here isn't fully it. Well, how do we know that what we experience here isn't fully it? How do we know that? So
Exactly.
this has been a question puzzled over by lots of people.
I'm saying, Father said he's getting speculative, but he's being speculative in a very rational sense because he's not drawing conclusions definitively. So he says immediately after what you just quoted, "I am not now inquiring. I'm simply posing the question: Does the life of happiness exist in the memory?" In other words, he's asking very profound questions to which he's not necessarily saying he has the answers.
Mhm.
But he is, in a sense, so he's presuming that there has to be an answer, and the answer can't be that I've experienced it directly. So, page 291, the new paragraph towards the bottom there, this sums it up. So, where and when did I experience my life of happiness, such remember, love, and desire it? That's, I want to go to 296 because now,
Can I,
go
Father,
ahead.
can I
Yeah.
just very briefly on that because this reminds me that question, that 31 you just read, of C.S. Lewis's, Surprised by Joy, just various of his works. Now that book, Surprised by Joy, is sort of autobiography, but in the Pilgrim's Regress, also at the beginning of it, he has this experience of joy. Doesn't know where it comes from. He doesn't really know what it is, but he knows he's had it. So it's the rest of his life, in some sense, is a quest to somehow relive that moment or rediscover that moment of joy. So, in that sense, it could be in the memory if we take it Lewis's way, but as an inkling, shall we say, is that somehow or other something happens to us that excites and ignites in us a desire for this transcendent happiness, but there's nonetheless some sort of seed of experience that sort of sets it off, that triggers it.
Yes, and that's a parallel that we talked about with the images of mathematical qualities and so on, or images of the categories. But do I recall this correctly, Joseph? I think that Lewis's experience of joy, he had an experience, but he realized it itself was not adequate. That there was a longing that was part of that experience. Is that not correct?
Exactly. So what it ignited was a suggestion of something eminently desirable that he only had a hint or a suggestion of in this transient and relatively momentary experience, but it triggers something, and is whatever that was, I want it again, and how do I get it again?
Right, but and this basically another example what you said, Vivian, that you have this experience, but you know it's I want it again, but it's not enough. It's not the fullness. It's a glimpse. It's a gleam. It's a small reflection. You know.
So in his book, The Pilgrim's Regress, that he describes it allegorically as seeing this image of the island, and this beautiful image of the island, and this sort of perfect thing, and then it gets polluted. So there are girls on the island, and the girls are also beautiful, but then the girls become seductive in a lustful way. In other words, that this purity, which was an instantaneous thing, immediately begins to become sort of sullied and stained by his own sinfulness, and the fallen world in which he finds himself.
And there's another aspect to this. I mean, in a purely speculative sense, we have to have some idea of justice to be able to decide whether something's just or not, or triangularity, or happiness, whatever. There's also the element of sin as an obfuscation or a darkening of our vision. And I'm thinking of the um, Till We Have Faces. Why is it that Orual can't see the castle that Psyche is in? You know, she she's got these unrecognized sins. That are, by the way,
Hmm.
not just individual acts, but she himself, as she'll find out in the second half of the book, is has become sin, so to speak. Her personality is her whole way of seeing things has been twisted by sin, which, by the way, is true of all of us. That's the problem. We confess our sins in confession, but those aren't the real sins. It's who we are is the sin. I mean, the problem is it's inextricably bound up with the good part of ourselves.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
the last thing I wanted to say on this particular topic here is on page 296 at the top. And then, Joseph, to prepare yourself, you're our designated reader. I want you to read that chapter 27. But above that, if that is so, where did I find you, God, in order to make acquaintance with you at the outset? You could not have been in my memory before I learned to know you. Where then could I have found you in order to learn of you, if not in yourself, far above me? Place has no meaning. This is interesting. See, he's using words, physical, local, space and time words. But when I say place, when I say you're above me, God, I don't really mean that you're, so many feet above the top of my head.
Hmm.
Place here has no meaning. Further away from you or toward you we may travel, but place there is none. So now he's saying, I, I, I know you. Uh, I made acquaintance with you, not in myself, but in you, because you are within me, but
Hmm.
not within in a spatial sense,
Hmm.
but in an ontological sense. Excuse me. Joseph, will you read this very famous passage for us, page chapter 27?
Hmm.
Yes, so you want me to read the whole of chapter 27 here, bottom half of the page?
Yeah.
Yeah. Late have I loved you, beauty so ancient and so new. Late have I loved you. Lo, you were within, but I outside, seeking there for you. and upon the shapely things you have made, I rushed headlong. I, misshapen. You were with me, but I was not with you. They held me back far from you, those things which would have no being were they not in you. You called, shouted, broke through my deafness. You flared, blazed, banished my blindness. You lavished your fragrance. I gasped, and now I pant for you. I tasted you, and I hunger and thirst. You touched me, and I burned for your peace.
That is truly glorious, is it not?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a beautiful poetic summary of what he's been talking about. That I sought God in things of the sensual order outside myself until you flashed. And he has all five sentences here. You called my ears, you flared my eyes, your fragrance. I pant for you, hunger and thirst and touch. And through all my senses, you were talking, but I was outside myself and you were within. This just, huh.
Yeah, and I love the poetic nature. It's not just in the poetry itself here, but in the way that the work as a whole, there's a certain point at which he has to break into song. You know, he's done all the prosaic trying to understand and get his head around things, but then ultimately he has to just let loose with beauty and break into song. I mean, Thomas Aquinas does the same thing, right, with the Corpus Christi sequence, right? All of the Summa Theologica and what have you, but faced with the reality of the real presence of Christ in the sacrament, he bursts into these marvelous songs which we still sing to these days. So at some point, this the only thing we can do is to sing.
And what's that beautiful expression? Only the lover sings.
Yes. Which in Latin is uh, cantare est amantis. To sing is of the lover.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of little phrase. By the way, another phrase here on page 298, at the beginning of that chapter 29. On your exceeding great mercy rests all my hope. Give me what you command, and then command whatever you will. Famous da quod ubes et ube quod vult. Quod vis. Da quod ubes et ube quod vis. So Augustine is the great theologian of grace. I can't do anything without you. I can't follow your command. So give me what you command, and then command whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't give it to me, I can't do it. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
The last thing I want to say in this chapter, this book, is on page. Oh, we're jumping way ahead to 324. Uh, again, this is his mysticism about maybe.
I have a couple of short things, Father, if I
Well,
may
well,
interject
go ahead.
briefly.
Intervene.
So,
Interject.
yeah,
Interfere.
306, page 306 at the bottom there, the bottom 5 lines.
Mm-hmm.
At times, it seems to me that I am paying them more honor than is their due, because I am aware that our minds are more deeply moved to devotion by those holy words when they are sung, and more ardently inflamed to piety than would be the case without singing. So we've
Mm-hmm.
just been talking about that, but that really, I think, in his own words,
Mm-hmm.
epitomizes what we were trying to say.
That's right.
Um,
I did quote that a couple of sessions ago when we talked about music and liturgy, but that's good. It's worth repeating, Joseph.
okay, he must have jumped forward and then gone back again. Sorry,
I did.
I'm sure I was. I'm sure I was paying attention at the time, Father.
Okay.
And
Anything before? Anything else?
309,
Go ahead.
309 briefly, if I may,
Oh yeah.
52 here, because I love this as well. O light, Tobit saw you when, despite the blindness of his carnal eyes, he pointed out the path of life to his son and strode unerringly ahead, borne by the feet of charity. Isaac saw you, though his bodily eyes were dimmed and closed by age, when true insight was granted him in blessing his sons, notwithstanding his inability to tell one from the other as he uttered his blessing. Jacob saw you when, likewise blinded by advanced age, he beheld by the radiant vision of his heart the tribes of the people that was to be was to be prefigured in his sons. Now, I know when I mentioned sort of just a literary analogy here, we see it with Tiresias in classical literature. We see it in Oedipus at Colonus, who uh, walks towards the sacred grove without a guide, although he's blind because he's been guided by the gods. In other words, that there's a certain vision that is an insight that does not actually require physical sight. And I think that metaphor is used both in pagan literature and obviously in the Old Testament examples here to show us the eyes of faith on it's not our physical eyes that are being used when we see with faith.
Anything else before 324? Anybody?
I will now desist.
Okay, 324, but just above the middle there. And this has to do with the idea of without Christ, there's no salvation. All salvation is in Christ. If that's the case, what about people who didn't know Christ before Christ came? And what about the so-called saints of the Old Testament? You know, was Moses saved by Christ? Was Isaac saved by Christ? Well, hear what Augustine says here. He, that is Christ, was pointed out to the holy people under the old dispensation that they might be saved through faith in his future passion, as we are through faith in that passion now accomplished. So the people of the Old Testament, and by extension, all the human race, saved by faith in the passion to come, as we are saved by the passion which we see in the past. So this is a great, beautiful, theological, mystical insight of St. Augustine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and people say, how can they go to heaven because they don't know Christ? And of course, it's not their fault. So how can they go to hell if if it's not their fault? But surely that's the whole point of purgatory, isn't it? Where the extent to which we don't know Christ for whatever reason, and there'll be an extent to which I don't know Christ when I die, then that will be the purgatorial process. So obviously, those that were through no fault of their own did not know Christ because they were born before his incarnation. Well, obviously, they will be the Christ will be revealed to them after death, and they will know him that way. That seems to me that purgatory is the obvious solution to that problem.
Yeah, and I would not say after death. I would say at death, because death is this transition which we get to time here. It doesn't exist as past or future. It's this amazingly infinitesimal moment. I think this is pretty good timing. We can conclude this session on Book 10. We'll come back and we'll start, maybe conclude Book 11, which is on time and eternity, another important philosophical topic of which Augustine is one of the great thinkers.